Hey, hey, and welcome back to the Healthy Returns podcast. I am Sharon Polsky, your host, and Healthy Returns is about better health and better business and unlocking the potential of body composition. And today's guests are Dave Looney and Adam Potter, and they are two of the biggest experts on BIA in the world. And we are going to talk about BIA being the gold standard of body composition testing. So I'm super excited about today's show. So stay tuned. I want to welcome you back to the Healthy Returns podcast. I'm your host, Sharon Polsky, and we are talking to Adam Potter and Dave Looney, who are BIA experts. Thank you so much for coming on the show, you guys.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
having
We appreciate it. Excited to talk with you, Sharon.
You guys can talk on top of each other. It's all good. So, Adam, tell us a little bit about your background and your experience with BIA.
Over the past 5 to 6 years or so, I've been really invested in endocrinology and body composition. And I could go down a long list of why I got into the BIA world. I mean, it is a significant part of the body composition world. Admittedly, I got into that to start because I didn't believe it would work. So I was, pleasantly surprised that there's a lot more promise than I originally had thought.
Dave, what is your background as a BIA expert?
Sure. So I am the human performance data scientist at Coach Me Plus. Our company develops software primarily for athlete monitoring systems. We had started mainly working with professional sports teams, collegiate organizations, but in recent years have really expanded out now to the point where we are working with the U.S. Army, the FDNY or firefighters, and other tactical athlete populations. My degrees are in exercise science, for which I got my MS and PhD over at the University of Connecticut. And over the last 10 years or so, I've been doing research on mainly exercise science topics with athletes, with warfighters, so soldiers, Marines, etc. And through all that time, we've done plenty of DEXAs and BIA tests. And for me, it's definitely has always been an interest. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about it, for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we talk about BMI all the time. BMI is very, very antiquated. It's not telling us the information it needs to. So how do we effectively replace BMI with the measurements that we can get from BIA?
Dave, you want to take this or is this me?
That's a great question. So body mass index, BMI, is going to be your body weight relative to your height squared. So that's something that is useful, basically just seeing how much you weigh, and whether you weigh more or less relative to your height than an average individual. So it's something that can account for differences in height across populations, so making it useful to be able to look at comparisons across a variety of people of varying heights, sizes, body masses. But what it doesn't tell you about is how muscular or fat you are, or how your weight is distributed across your body. And that's where something like a body composition assessment like BIA comes in. So through a BIA test, you can get information about your total body water, intracellular, extracellular water, as well as information about your percent body fat, muscle mass, etc.
Also, with BMI, it's so antiquated, it really doesn't take into consideration that women in 2025 are now lifting weights, which wasn't what happened at the time that BMI was created. And so we're hoping to see this shift away from BIA. And I think everybody in our industry is hoping that we will start replacing that with BIA technology. Is that something that we are going to see on the horizon, Adam? Do you think that's going to happen?
I think so. I mean, so right now, everything in science has been started off with here's a man, and then here's a man with more fat, and that's what a woman is. So we know that the body composition of men and women are different. We know that fat distribution is different. So men generally, have subcutaneous fat, but they also, once they have excess fat, it goes to their abdomen. Whereas women distribute fat throughout the body. It's different for individuals. There's a difference in minimum essential fat for women and men. So if you're trying to scale those two people the same, it just doesn't work. So Dave and I had actually looked at a large scale population of data throughout the US population in the NHANES data. So this is a cross-sectional sampling of data that's done every year or continuously for 2-year increments. We took a population of about 16,000 or almost 17,000 men and women, so about 8,000 of each. And in that, we actually plotted out BMI to body fat by DEXA. And one, you can see that there's a very distinct difference between the distribution of men and women to that scale. But you can also see that there's this really large range. So like if you just picked 30 BMI, what does that line up to on the DEXA? The range goes from 20% to 50% body fat by DEXA. So that alone just kind of shows that there's a huge gap in terms of what you're getting out of that simple metric.
So in our BIA technology, what are the metrics, the specific metrics that we as an industry would like to see being used instead of BMI, Dave? What would those be for you?
Definitely percent body fat. I think that's generally what people are looking at. That's really been limited over the years by accessibility and cost, right? It's much easier to find a scale to take your body weight on,
Yeah.
get your height, and then make this simple calculation. Whereas BIA has been a little bit more difficult to acquire. But nowadays, I mean, you can see BIA devices at your local gyms.
Yeah, and I think that's the key to this is because now with BIA, you can't do this with DEXA. You can't monitor your progress every 30 days. So whether you're just a gym enthusiast or you're just trying to improve your basic health, and that we need to be able to see our total body water, our visceral body fat, our skeletal muscle mass, and we need to be able to monitor that every 30 days. And it's just not accessible through DEXA or even MRI. And BIA has made it so accessible. Like you said, it's in your military offices, it's in almost every gym, and it's also now in almost every health and wellness clinic in the United States. So it is really, really, BIA is just so accessible. And then to your point, I think there's a lot of practical considerations of BIA versus DEXA or MRI. Adam, correct me if I'm wrong. What are those practical considerations for integrating BIA?
New York State can't have a DEXA in different areas because there's different rules for radiation safety. Organizations generally have to be trained for radiation safety. Reading a DEXA apparently it isn't intuitive to everybody. I mean, I read them like, my diaries now. And there's a high cost. There's a high cost for, purchasing it. There's an upkeep cost. You move it or touch it the wrong way, it's got to get calibrated. So there's a lot of things that, practically it's difficult to do. You could go on a long time about, I think that's probably the high end of the reasonable. The higher end is, MRI, CT scan. Your risks start going through the roof, exponentially higher costs. Training is even harder. Interpretation is still kind of a witch doctor game there to figure out how do you interpret things for those.
Well, I was just going to say, but also DEXA and MRI, they're not a direct measure of body composition. They're still an estimate based on an algorithm, correct?
So they are. They are estimates. I think this gets into one of the comments that I love to say. So one of my mentors, Carl Friedel, so he would say there's no real direct measure of body composition unless you want to melt the human down and section out the different tissues and ladle off the fat, and then there you go. But that's really not practical. You can do it once, to assess your body composition. But I think you're right. So all of these are indirect in some fashion. I think there's elements that are kind of assumed. There's empirical equations throughout each of them. There's fixes and fudge factors between each of them. Going off, back to BIA, the technology itself is generally pretty cheap. So when you think about, the sensors, the electrodes, and sending current through, tissue, that's not an expensive technology. the hardware to set up that stuff, the firmware to keep it going, and is another thing. But the algorithms is really that prime piece there. So if you said every single BIA system out there now that's, actually commercialized well had the same algorithms, I would guess you'd have just about the same measures, assuming they're measured from the same contacts, and same frequencies and directions. If you were going to pick, one, BIA system, as long as it's a repeatable system, taking that measurement today versus and then taking it tomorrow is generally pretty good.
Yeah, because our goal
So I
really
think
is just to measure progress by creating comparable scans. Yeah, Dave, what are your ideal scanning conditions and what are those outside factors that do influence BIA results?
For sure. So things like what you've had to eat or how much you've had to drink beforehand, body temperature, time of day. So there are a lot of different considerations. Honestly, probably the easiest way to have consistent testing would be to do it shortly after you wake up. So as soon as you get up in the morning, got to go to the bathroom, do that. If you head to the gym, go do that, and then get your BIA assessment. And that way, approximately, you're testing at the same time of day. You're not going to have to run into issues of, say, like testing after you've had some really difficult exercise, you've had to sweat, or you've had a ton of blood flow. And in that way, it's a way that you can make sure that the differences that you're seeing in the measurements aren't because of outside factors. It's because, yes, you are changing in terms of body composition or body water.
Don't you think that the multiple electrodes also are what mitigates some of that? So when we have some of the cheaper BIA technology that doesn't have the multiple electrodes, that we're not getting as accurate data as these more robust machines that do have that. Is that what you're experiencing, Dave?
Yeah, so the multi-frequency approach has definitely been a huge improvement. For us, like definitely ensuring that the participants maintain ideal body posture, go through all the same steps is super important. When we did our controlled test, we found that the retest reliability. So if you were to do a BIA, like the same BIA assessment back to back, we found that that was extremely reliable, meaning that the technology itself is pretty precise. Where we found some differences are in just like the general average difference between DEXA and BIA in terms of like percent body fat. But it was something which was rather consistent. So as you were talking about before, even if there are differences between these technologies, if you're looking at something just in terms of tracking differences over time, provided that you're doing the same test and you're doing it in the same conditions, you can account for those general overall differences. But, what's most important is seeing how you are changing over those periods of time.
And I think that's where the training comes on the front end. Like I was saying when we were talking earlier, that I just think that people are very poorly trained. So it's a guy owns a gym and he buys one and then he just has people stand on it and result sheet prints. And we aren't actually creating consistent scanning conditions. But when we see consistent scanning conditions, the way they hold the electrode, the way they hold the handles, the way they position their feet, they're not standing on their pants, they're like standing up tall, they're not hunched over, their arms aren't touching their sides. Once we really train people on how to create consistent scanning conditions, then I definitely see the results are always reproducible with all BIA technology. What do you say to those people that say, oh, BIA is, if you go onto Reddit and you search BIA, people will say, BIA is notoriously inaccurate in general. How do you guys defend against that?
violently. Oh,
I do too.
That's a great question. I think most people, most of those folks are probably used to those single frequency BIAs where it's that handheld device or it's the scale. And they're used to saying, oh, well, I step on the scale and it's totally off and all BIA is bad. And they haven't had the exposure to these multi-frequency systems. And, as we mentioned before, we have found, and others have found as well, that these multi-frequency systems are highly reliable and they're overall relatively precise, particularly when you compare them to a DEXA. What we have found is in general, they tend to be about 3% body fat less. In terms of if you were to take a BIA and a DEXA, you would be 3% less on the multi-frequency BIA system versus the DEXA. Now, is that the biggest problem in the world? Not really, if it's something that's consistent, right? So just kind of like a rule of thumb, if you want to approximate what your body fat would be with a DEXA by taking a BIA measurement, just add 3%.
Can I ask a really obnoxious question?
Sure.
Who's to say the DEXA body fat percentage was more accurate than the BIA body fat percentage?
We actually hear that question all the time. And I think, we know that it's not perfect. We know that none of the systems are perfect unless you go back to, melting a human down. There's inherent flaws. I think so from us and for, I guess, the rest of the community, it's really understanding what those limitations and assumptions are of those systems. So we know that there's a few assumptions in the DEXA systems. We know that the two main companies for DEXAs don't even exactly line up. For bone they do because bone is a hard thing to miss in an X-ray. But things for like the soft tissue or the methods of how they get visceral fat, we know that those two things aren't a one-to-one comparison. So it really comes back down to picking, your measure and then measuring it to that same measure. Yeah, and I think, the accuracy part is fun because when you look at kind of the same thing you've been saying this whole time, if you have that standardized procedure, the accuracy is going to essentially become globally accepted because now, we see across the industries, everybody does a little different, does a little something different here, does their comparison a little different. And that's really probably the biggest issue with how you'd compare, the two measures. But really, it's that, the retest reliability, if everything was tested on that one BIA system, we would assume it's the most accurate thing in the world. I mean, that's just the way it works.
So if when we're going out to purchase a BIA scanner and without a specific brand in mind, so no brand favorability, what are the features that are most important to consider when buying a BIA scanner?
Consistency, reliability, definitely some validation studies that have proven, yes, this technology works because there's so many different products and, and all across the health industries that are trying to sell you something and say, hey, we're going to use this device. It's going to give you, estimates of your body fat or your body composition. And, you want to make sure that those numbers are accurate, that they are something that you can rely on. And so I think for me, those are some of the biggest components for sure. So yeah, I would agree with that.
And you want multiple frequency, correct?
Oh, yes, of course.
I think we went over the things that are so basic to the three of us that we're assuming people know that, but I really think I actually had a doctor tell me last week, why wouldn't I just buy a bathroom scale and put it in my clinic that also tests BIA? And this was a doctor telling it to me, and she was going to be prescribing GLP-1s on this. And then I had to explain to her the differences between multi-frequency. I just assumed every doctor would know that, and she didn't.
Yeah, sorry, we missed that point. But yes, multi-frequency BIA is the way to go. You can buy the other instruments, and they'll give you numbers, but there's no guarantee they're going to be anywhere near accurate. And honestly, if you're going to do retest reliability, you'll probably get way different numbers, even if you're just testing back to back.
And I was just going to say, the repeatability for me is such a important issue, as I need to be able to measure progress by creating comparable scans. So they have to be repeatable. And so I find if it isn't multi-frequency, there's no repeatability.
Yeah, I think, another piece to that is, especially for you, it's something we look at and everyone should I guess, inherently care about it, is trackability. So like we know that, I think we might have said this before the camera we were recording, but not everything traces those changes in body composition. So the Army had done these studies where they were looking at basic trainees that were losing weight over, or significant weight over a certain period of time, and they were doing their anthropometric measures, and those anthropometric measures were not capturing the predicted body fat changes that they actually saw by DEXA. So one, we'd say, anthropology is, a dying, piece of science. But the BIA system, on the other hand, by design, should actually capture more of those things, because you're getting a measure through the tissue and assuming what those distributions of different tissues are. So I think traceability is a pretty big deal, especially for, say, a GLP-1, or for someone in the fitness industry or military, where we're seeing that there's a drastic change, or a relatively quick change to body composition that you want to be able to capitalize on and say, okay, am I losing lean mass, or am I gaining lean mass? And what do I do to intervene, good or bad?
I'm going to ask you both the same question. So Adam, I'm going to ask you it first. If you had any advice for anybody considering integrating BIA into either their clinical practice or their gym or their business, what would that advice be?
Well, one, they have to read everything written by Lee Ward, Grant Tinsley, myself, Carl Friedel, and Dave Looney.
So
But no,
education, no, you're right. Education would be number one. So that'd be most important.
but I think actually having somebody explain the systems to them, and really push the things that you've already talked about. I think standardizing these things is really important. Because we know, just kind of us in the lab standing on these systems and moving around or doing something different, putting in the wrong height, throws everything off. So I think really getting an SOP for those places to use, and then maybe, reinforcing it with, here's some published data that shows, this actually does what you're looking for. That would be, my first start.
Yeah, so I agree with you. Education for staff and education for patients, clients, or members. Like, I think we need education on both sides. So Dave, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally the system would be able to connect with either your phone or a wearable and be able to upload your data right away, so you can track it, on the fly. Particularly if it's one of those name brand multi-frequency systems, it's something where if you go to another gym that has it, you can take that assessment and then have that be uploaded. So I think just being able to track and monitor that is super important. And then just looking at things like just cost, feasibility, with like how much is it going to be to maintain. I think with most of these multi-frequency systems, the upkeep is much cheaper than for some of those larger criterion methods, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with both those. Well, I want to thank you guys for joining me for the Healthy Returns podcast and talking all things BIA. And I really appreciate you guys coming and talking today.
For sure. Thank you so much for having us. I appreciate the invite.
Thanks, you guys. Have a great
much.
day.
All right, take care.
So that was Adam Potter and Dave Looney. And I am so appreciative that they came and talked all things BIA with us on our Healthy Returns podcast. Better health, better business, unlocking the potential of body composition. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. If you enjoyed today's show, please like and subscribe. And for more information on eVolt, you can go to www.evolt360.com. I'm your host, Sharon Polsky, and I want to thank you all for tuning in. Have a great day. Ciao for now. The eVolt podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. The content shared here represents the views and opinions of the host and guests and should not be considered medical, health, or professional advice. This podcast is not a substitute for individualized care from a qualified provider. Please consult with your provider before making decisions that may affect your health and wellness. Any statements about treatments, health protocols, or medications discussed are based on personal experience or professional expertise and may not be suitable for everyone. Always seek personalized advice from a licensed professional who understands your specific needs.